Hello, welcome to Getting Started with Windows on the Intel Galileo. My name is Brett Stateham. I'm a Microsoft Technical Evangelist, and you can find me on the web at brettstateham.com or on Twitter at brettstateham. In this session, we're going to start out with an overview of Microsoft's Windows Developer Program for IoT. And then we'll show you how to take the free version of Windows available through that program and get it installed and running on your Intel Galileo board. And once your Galileo is running Windows, we'll then show you how to write and run code in Windows on your Galileo. And finally, we'll wrap up with some next steps and see where to go from here. If you're interested, you can get a copy of all the files in this session as well as all the other sessions in this series. The aka.ms IoT source link up there at the top jumps you into GitHub and gives you the repository with all the source code for the demos and slides, etc. Or you can use the IoT zip link to download a zip file with the latest version of everything in it. And then the IoT vids link will take you off to a playlist with all the videos in this series. So let's dive right in and look at the Windows Developer Program for IoT. Now, Microsoft has actually been running Windows on embedded devices for a very long time. But at the latest Build conference back in April, there were announcements around a free version of Windows that can run on embedded devices. And to learn more about that, you can jump up to windowsondevices.com and sign up to be a Windows IoT developer. And once you complete that process, you can then get access to the free versions of Windows that are made available. Now, in this session, we're going to be talking about the Intel Galileo board, but there are more boards than just the Galileo that are part of this program. In fact, we just recently announced support for the Minnow board as well as for the Sharks Cove. And you can learn more about those boards if you jump up to aka.ms WCHDB. That'll talk about the Windows compatible hardware development boards, and you can get the specs on all of those. And in fact, there was just last week a live stream on Channel 9 that talks about these and what their capabilities are and why you might use one over the other. So jump up and check out those links. So let's get started installing Windows on the Intel Galileo. Now the hardware that you'll need is of course an Intel Galileo, and in this session we're focusing on the Gen 1 board. Of course, you'll also need the power supply for your Galileo. And then to run Windows, you need a micro SD card that we can load the Windows operating system onto. Now, the Windows on Devices site says that you need a 16 gigabyte card or bigger, but I've actually run it on an 8 gig card. You ought to be able to go even smaller than that because the image actually isn't that large. But the more the better, of course. And then, of course, you're going to need the adapter so that you can plug your micro SD card into a regular SD card writer and some sort of SD card reader-writer for your PC. And then lastly, once your Galileo is running Windows, you'll connect it up to the network with an Ethernet cable and then actually communicate directly with your PC initially over Ethernet. So you want to make sure that your PC also has an Ethernet port available. Now, Microsoft has also been shipping some dev kits that have all of this hardware as well as a USB to Ethernet connector for a number of lucky devs who've registered on the windowsondevices.com site. However, if you've bought your own Galileo, the steps that I outline here show you how to provision Windows for yourself. So if you have a hardware dev kit, you don't actually have to apply the Windows image, although the information here is helpful if you need to update your Windows image to a newer version. But either way, whether you brought your own Galileo or if you got one through a dev kit from Microsoft, then these instructions are useful to you. Now, I mentioned that in this video, we're going to be focusing on the Intel Galileo Gen 1 boards. Now, while the Gen 2 boards are available, they're not currently supported by the Windows Developer Program for IoT. And the team hasn't made any announcements or promises, but I'd hope to see some support for the Gen 2 boards coming in the near future. The other thing that you'll want to make sure of is that the firmware on your Intel Galileo board has been updated. Now, I won't cover that here. I've already covered the process for doing that in the previous video, so you can use the link on the screen there and jump back and see how to do it there if need be. Now, when you write code for your Intel Galileo running Windows, you're actually going to do it using Visual Studio 2013 or later. Of course, if you have a full version of Visual Studio, you can use that. Or if you need Visual Studio, you can download a free copy of Visual Studio Express 2013 for Windows Desktop. Now, if you do that, make sure to get the Windows Desktop version of Express, not just the one for Windows. That lets you create Windows 8 Store apps. To work with your Galileo, you need the Windows Desktop version. That's going to let you write C++ console applications that you can then deploy and run on your Intel Galileo. to communicate with your Galileo from your PC for administrative tasks, the easiest way is to use Telnet. And so Windows actually ships with a Telnet client, but it's no longer installed by default. So to use that on your development machine, you're going to want to jump into your control panels, program and features, then click on that turn Windows features on or off link over on the left-hand side, and then turn on the checkbox next to the Telnet client. And then when you click OK, it'll go out and install that for you. It just takes a minute or two, and then you'll have the Telnet client available. Now there's still a few things that you need to get, and these next downloads require that you have first completed the registration process I mentioned back on the first slide about the windowsondevices.com website. So make sure that you complete that registration process so that you can get these other downloads. But the first download you'll want to get is the Windows Developer Program for IoT Microsoft Installer. Now that's going to install some Visual Studio project templates that you can use to create your Galileo apps. It's also going to include a utility called the Galileo Watcher. That's a utility that you'll run on your development workstation, and it'll help you discover the Galileos on your network and help you connect to them. The next download is the Windows Developer Program for IoT Windows Image, or WIM file. That's going to be a big long file name, and make sure to just download the latest version of it. That's the actual Windows image, though, that's going to be applied to the SD card, and that you'll then turn around and boot your Galileo from. And then lastly, there's the Windows Developer Program for IoT apply-bootmedia.cmd file. And that's the script file you'll use to actually apply that Windows image file from above onto the SD card. So for me, it makes sense to download those two files, that CMD and the WIM file, into the same target directory. Now before you can actually apply the image to your SD card, you'll first need to make sure to format your SD card. That apply boot media CMD file will fail or error out if there's stuff on your micro SD card. And then, so as I mentioned, it's helpful if you download that apply-bootmedia.cmd and that big long, star.wim file into the same download directory. So, for example, here I've got them in a Galileo folder off the root of my C drive. And then, of course, I've got my freshly formatted micro SD card sitting over in the D drive. So from there, I can open up an administrative command prompt and change into that Galileo directory. And then I can use that apply-bootmedia batch file and set it up to apply that image off to my SD card. So I'll tell it the destination is the D drive, that's my micro SD card. I'll tell it the image is that big long star.wim file that I downloaded into the same directory. And then there's a few other key parameters. There's a hostname parameter that will actually set the hostname of the Windows image on that SD card. And it's recommended that you use My Galileo, at least initially, and that's because the project templates in Visual Studio are set up to automatically remote debug against a host called My Galileo. Now you're free to use another name, just be aware that you'll have to update your remote debug configurations in the future there. And then also your Windows image is going to have a built-in administrator user, and so we need to set the password for it. And so here we're setting the password to admin. But when you press enter on that batch file, it's going to run for a while, and it'll actually take probably up to about 10 minutes to complete. That apply image with 100% going across there takes a little bit of time, so just be patient and wait for it to complete. But when it's done, it'll report back to you the host name and administrator username and password that you specified there. So make sure to remember those values because you'll need them to connect to your Galileo in the future. Now, all of these steps are documented. You can use the link on the screen to go up and look at the self-provisioning instructions for getting the Windows image set up on a micro SD card that you can boot your Intel Galileo from. So let's go give it a try. Let's look at creating a Windows boot image for your Intel Galileo. So first of all, let me show you a couple of the websites we talked about. Remember that windowsondevices.com actually redirects you over to this page, but this is the Windows Developer Program for IoT. And make sure in there that you complete that register to be a IoT developer today. Once you complete that process, you'll have permissions to the downloads. In fact, the downloads then are linked to off of that I bought a Galileo page, but there's direct downloads to the image as well as that apply bootmedia.cmd file. But if you actually follow one of those links over there, you'll notice at the top of that page is a general downloads link. And so that's really this page over here. I'll just close that up. But here's a list of all those downloads. I talked about the applied boot media script file, the Windows image file or that WIM file, and also the installer that gives you the Visual Studio project templates and the Galileo watcher. So again, you want to make sure to go download those. And then there's the EULA and the privacy documentation that you can read as well. But those first three are those big three downloads that we talked about needing. And so over here on my C drive, I've already copied those out into my Galileo directory. So I've got those sitting in the directory here ready for me. There's this big, hideously named .win file, so that's a super long file name. I've got the apply-bootmedia.cmd, and then in the same directory, I also have that MSI installer, and I've already installed that. Now, I also mentioned going into your programs and features in the control panel and under turn Windows features on or off, making sure that you have that Telnet client installed. And I've already done that, but you'd simply turn on the checkbox and hit OK, and it installs it pretty darn quickly for you. All right, so now I'm about ready to go set up the SD card. So I've got an SD card. Jump over to my camera here, right? So I've got a little micro SD card, and I've got the little adapter that comes with it. So I'll just go ahead and slip the SD card into the adapter. So there's that. And then I've got a handy little USB to SD card reader that I'll use to plug this into my computer. So I'll just snap that in and then go hook it up into my computer. And now I can jump back over to that command prompt window, and I'm going to use that apply boot media, and I'll just hit tab to complete that out. And I want to let it know that the destination, in fact, if I go back here and look at my machine here, that looks like that came in as my D drive. So there's that SD card that just loaded up as the removable disk D. It's empty, but I could make sure of that. I could right click on it and go into the properties, or sorry, to format, and then reformat it right there. But I'm good here, so since it's good and empty, we'll give it a try at least. So it's going to be that D:\\. There's the destination. I need to let it know the image that I'm going to use. So I'm going to type in image, and then I need that big, long start.wim file. Well, if I just hit tab, the command line completion is going to go find the next file name and just use it. So luckily, I didn't have to type all that out. So I just typed tab, and it found the file name for me. And then I'm going to do -hostname. And remember, it's recommended that you call it My Galileo unless you have a good reason to call it something else. The main reason for that is that those Visual Studio project templates are going to want to remote debug against My Galileo by default. So if you change it here, you'll have to change the remote debugging configurations there as well. And then finally, I'll give it the password for my administrative account, and I'll just use the recommended or the documented admin one. So I press enter on that, and that's now going to, as I said, take some time here. So you'll notice this kicks off and gets running here. It's going to mount the image, save the image, unmount the image. Goes through a few different gyrations here to make sure that it's able to actually work with the image. And then you hit some downtime where you seem to get no response. But we'll pause here for a sec, and shortly this should come back to us. Okay, that actually took a couple of minutes here before it gave me any more feedback here. But I now see this applying image at 1%, and it'll continue to build up to 100%. You'll see the equal signs sort of spill across the screen as that goes. So again, let me just pause so we can see one or two of those happen. All right, well, you can see it sort of moving along here. It seems to be taking really long for me this time. Now, I've actually got my SD card plugged into a USB 2 port, plus I'm recording on the same machine, so that may be slowing it down. Hopefully yours will go a little bit faster for you. But the last time I went through this, the total time was about 10 minutes. Anyhow, at this point, I'll go ahead and jump back over and continue to go through some of the other discussion here while I let this run in the background. Once your SD card's finished imaging, you're now ready to boot the Galileo, right? So we mentioned the hardware. Again, you need your Galileo board, an Ethernet cable, the SD card with the image on it, and the power cord, and of course the PC you're going to hook it up to. So the first thing you're going to do is go ahead and directly connect the Ethernet from your Galileo right up to your host PC. Now for this, we're going to assume a direct connection. Yes, you can go through a network, but the direct connection is going to help eliminate any other networking issues that might come into play and help us focus just on the PC to Galileo communications. You'll then want to take the SD card that has your Windows image in it and go ahead and stick it into the SD card slot, and then of course power up your Galileo. Now when you do that, the Galileo is going to start booting off of that Windows OS, and you'll see that SD light flicker while it does the reads from the SD card. That'll actually take a while. It could take 2 minutes or possibly more for your Galileo to boot. So just monitor that light, and once it settles down, you'll have a pretty good sense that it's finished booting. And from an IP address perspective, both the Galileo and your host PC will receive what's called a PIPA, Automatic Private IP Addressing address. And each one of them will have a 169.254.something.something sort of random address that you can use to communicate between the two pieces. Once that SD card light has stopped flickering over on your Galileo, back over on your host PC, you can run that Galileo Watcher executable. Remember, that got installed with that installer that we talked about downloading previously. Now, the first time you run it, it's going to show up empty, and in fact, it's probably going to prompt you to enable a firewall rule to allow this to talk to the network. So it's helpful the first time if you go ahead and run Galileo Watcher as administrator. But go ahead and allow those firewall rules, and then eventually the Galileo Watcher should detect your Galileo out there on the network. And it'll show you its host name and its IP address and when the last time it heard from the Galileo. And what Galileo Watcher is doing is actually looking for some multicast messages that are sent out from your Galileo about once every 5 seconds. So if for some reason it's not communicating, you could actually go get a packet analyzer like Wireshark and take a look on that segment and see if you see those multicasts coming across. But those messages actually include the Galileo's host name and IP address and that kind of stuff. So as long as those are coming across, the Galileo Watcher should be able to see them. Regardless, once you've got it, you can either use the Galileo Watcher to right-click on the entry for your Galileo and pick Telnet there, or Telnet here, sorry, or you can actually just open up a command prompt and use that Telnet client and point to either the My Galileo host or its IP address. And then from there, you can actually Telnet in. Now remember, you're going to use the username administrator, and then for the password, you'll use whatever password you specified back when you ran that apply-boot media script. But at that point, you should get a remote command prompt against your Galileo board. There is, in fact, also a little web server set up on the Galileo by default. So you can just open up your browser and point to http://mygalileo, or whatever you called your Galileo's host name. And there's a few links there. There's a task list that'll show you the things that are running. The file list, for me, actually fails whenever I try it. But then there's also a memory statistics that'll let you know what the current memory stats are over on the Galileo. And then you can also actually connect up to your Galileo as a network share. So if you just open up, the File Explorer, and in the address bar do / my Galileo, or again, whatever your host name was, and then /C$, you'll be prompted to authenticate with your administrator credentials. So again, the username is administrator, and the password is whatever you specified as your administrator password on the Galileo. And at that point, you should actually get a remote full file system view of your Galileo's contents. So let's jump over and actually take a look at booting our Galileo up to Windows. All right, so I'm back at the command prompt that we were running where we were provisioning the image onto that SD card. And you can see that it here did in fact complete, and it's repeating back to me, again, the host name that I specified, which is my Galileo, the username administrator, and the password of admin. And again, remember, you're going to want to make sure to recall those values later as you connect to your Galileo. So now I'm ready to jump over and actually try and boot off that image. So let me jump back over to my camera here. And I've got my Galileo. I've also got the power cord ready. I've got the Ethernet cord or cable ready here. And I've already got the other end of that Ethernet cable plugged into the Ethernet port on my computer. And let me go yank that SD card out of my USB port here. All right. And so there it is. And I'll just remove that little micro SD card out of the slot or the adapter there, right? And then it's going to slip right inside this guy here, right? So there's the micro SD card slot on the Galileo. I then want to go ahead and connect up my Ethernet port, and then I ought to be able to just plug it in. Now remember, when I do that, there's this SD light right down here in the lower left-hand corner. So you'll get the on for the power, and then the SD light's going to flicker. So you can sit and watch those guys. But let me go ahead and plug this in. I see the power light. And then again, this is going to flicker away here for a little while Windows actually boots up. So again, I'll wait for some lights to flicker, and then I'll pause this and wait for it to complete the process. All right, it looks like my SD card lights are flickering away, so I'm going to go ahead and pause for a little bit and wait for that to boot to complete. All right, so now back over on my machine, now that that's booted, I can go run that Galileo watcher. So I'm going to go pull that up. Now remember, this got installed with the that installer that we downloaded previously there, or talked about downloading previously. So I can see here that it's actually detecting my Galileo out there on the network. There's that 169.254 APIPA address. In this case, it's .79.152. And there's these messages coming out, looks like about once every 5 seconds. And so as long as it sees it once every 5 seconds, Galileo Watcher knows that it's online. All right, and so now I can actually right-click on this guy and come down to Telnet here. And so I'll do that. And remember the administrator username, and I used the password admin, so I'll enter that in. And hopefully this will work out for us here. There we are. So I'm now sitting at a command prompt for my Galileo, and here's my Windows System 32 directory. I go back to the root, take a look at it that way. Remember I mentioned that you can also browse to your Galileo. So let me close up my Telnet window, right click, and you'll notice there's a web browser here. So I'll do that. And here I am looking at it. There's a task list that'll show me everything that's running in memory. I mentioned that for me at least, the file list seems to fail. Let's see if it works on this one. Nope, out of space for output. So I'm not sure what the deal is there. But I'll come back to memory statistics. And there that is. So what's going on in mem. And then lastly, we mentioned that there is a remote network share. So you can actually open that up as a network share. It'll hook me up to trying to go to the C dollar. And again, you've got to authenticate. So I'll use the administrator username and admin password. And there it is. Now I've got a file system view. And that's great for copying files back and forth between your host PC and the Galileo. All right, so my Galileo is now up and running, and I'm ready to come back and start writing some code. And before I switch back, I do want to mention that in the Galileo Watcher, this was not coming up for me initially as I just booted this Galileo up with this newly provisioned SD card. And I made sure to wait the plenty of minutes for it to boot. And the trick for me seemed to be a number of iterations of just booting that up. So in the gap between when I left the Galileo booting and when I resumed the demo here, I actually took some time here and let the Galileo reboot just by unplugging it, plugging it back in, letting it go through the full cycle. And after a few times of doing that, making sure to wait plenty of minutes, somewhere probably between 3 and 5 minutes, if not longer, each time around, it eventually started showing up in the Galileo Watcher for me. So I still haven't figured out exactly what the right process there is to get this to show up sooner, but after a few attempts at rebooting, it's now showing up for me. All right, well with that, let me jump back over and start taking a look at writing code for your Galileo. Awesome. Well, now our Galileo is booting to Windows. So next, let's take a look at writing and running code in Windows on the Galileo. Now, first of all, remember I mentioned that when we work with the Galileo in Windows, we're actually going to be writing C++ applications that call into this wiring API, and that was implemented for us in this Galileo SDK. Now you could actually go download that separately, and there's instructions in there to build a NuGet package that you could actually apply to your solutions, etc. But if you use the Visual Studio project templates that are part of that installer that we talked about earlier, then you don't have to worry about that stuff. Now the SDK is up there though. If you want to download it and look at it or even contribute to it, it's up there on GitHub, so you can use the link there on the screen to go get engaged with that. So as I mentioned then, if you download the Microsoft installer, you get this Visual Studio project template, and then inside your File New Project under Visual C++, there will now be a Windows for IoT category, and inside there is the Galileo Wiring App project template. So you want to use that as an easy way to get started writing C++ code that's going to run in Windows on your Galileo. And inside those projects then, underneath the source files folder is this main.cpp, and that's where the majority of your code is going to go inside there. And the contents of that file look pretty much like the default Blink sketch that you would have seen back over in an Arduino regular IDE sketch. There are a few differences. You'll notice that up at the top there's this _t main method that's going out and running the run Arduino sketch method, and that's part of that Galileo SDK library. But otherwise, the lower part looks just like sort of the default Blink application that you would use sort of as the canonical hello world in the Arduino. For the most part, it looks identical. About the only difference is this log method, and that's part of the Galileo SDK, and that'll be used to write output both to the stdout as well as to a debugger if one is attached. And then lastly, and I've mentioned this a couple of times in the past, the Visual Studio projects are set up for remote debugging. So you'll run Visual Studio on your host PC, you're connected through the network, in our case at least initially directly through Ethernet, up to our Galileo board. And then when we hit debug, by default it actually wants to use a remote debugger. Now you can actually right click on your project in the Solution Explorer inside Visual Studio and go into Properties to change the debugging configuration. But we see that under the debugging properties, by default, it wants to use the remote Windows debugger. It's going to go find that My Galileo host name. So that's where if you used a different host name for your Galileo, you'd want to come in and change it here to match up to the appropriate host name. But what it's going to do is on that target Galileo, in its target file system, it's going to create a folder called test off of the C drive, and then it's going to run the output file into or from that folder, right? So it's going to create that directory and actually deploy the executable, which in this case is really a console application that just has a reference off to the Galileo SDK. But it'll then go out and actually launch that executable on the Galileo and then hook up to it. Now remember, when you do that, you also have to have permissions. So it's going to use Windows authentication, and you'll need to enter in your administrator username and password when you debug for the first time during a session. With that, let's go take a look at it. Let's write and run some code in Windows on our Galileo. All right, so I've got Visual Studio open. From the File menu, I'm going to do File, New, Project. And underneath the Visual C++ category, I now have this Windows for IoT. And again, that's because I downloaded and installed this Windows Developer Program for IoT. Oops, sorry, this one down here, the Microsoft installer. So that's the download that's going to get you the Visual Studio project templates as well as that Galileo watcher, right? But since I've run that, I have this category, and I've got the Galileo wiring app project template. So I've got a directory here that I'm going to create this in. I'll just call my project Hello Galileo. All right, and let it create a directory for the solution. That looks good. All right, so here it is, and underneath the source files folder is that main.cpp, and I can open that up. And again, I mentioned that up here at the top, this stuff looks a little bit different than a traditional Arduino sketch would look. I've got this funky _t main, but that's basically the main method that's going to get called when this program is run for me. Remember, this is really a console program. It just has references, if I go over here to the external dependencies, off to that Galileo SDK, right? So if I look through there, you'll see a number of files in there. Including, for example, there's the Arduino.h, and there's some other ones in there as well. But that's the main program that's going to be run, and then it runs this run Arduino sketch. And if I actually went and looked at the definition of that, you'd see that it's a method that's in fact in that Arduino.h header file. But it's going to initialize the Arduino, and then it calls the Arduino setup method. Well, my setup method back over in main.cpp, and then it's just going to infinitely loop, right? While true, just call the loop method. And so those are that setup method over here. So it's going to call that once, and here we're setting the pin mode on pin 13 to output, and then it's going to infinitely call loop, and loop here is going to do the same old low, high with a delay of a 1 second between. And if you haven't seen the Blink demo before, again, you can watch the previous video. I mentioned that earlier in here, where we sort of walk through sort of the Hello Arduino samples there. Remember that we're using the log method here, and that's going to write out to the std out as well as to the debugger with it attached. All right, lastly then, let me go back over to my Solution Explorer here, and in the Hello Galileo, I'll right-click and come down to my project properties. And on the debugging page, I see that it's set up for the remote Windows debugger by default. It's going to try and deploy to my Galileo. It's going to deploy out to the test folder on the Galileo, and then it's going to run that program on the Galileo and hook up to it here. So let me OK on that. And then lastly, let's jump back over here and take a look at the Galileo. Right, so I've got it there. And then with the good old Blink sample here, we're going to be using pin 13, which is the pin that we were using in the sketch or the program back over there. And so I'm going to hook a LED up here. Make sure to use the anode long leg and stick that into pin 13. And the other one is going to go into ground, which is right next to it. So I'll go ahead and wire those guys in there. Ignore its state right now. And let me go ahead and run this sketch here. Run it. Actually, I'll tell you what, let me pull my camera up, split view here so we can see it. And get Visual Studio back over there. And so I'll go ahead and hit the debug button here. Start debugging. And yes. All right, doing a deploy. Deploy succeeded. And you should be able to see in the camera view now that my LED is in fact blinking. And over here in the debug window, remember I have a debug or a debugger attached. I can see those LED on and LED off log messages that were here inside the loop. Showing up there. So that's really cool, right? So I actually get step through debugging, and I can communicate with my debugger, or sorry, with my Galileo in a much richer way than you would with just the standard Arduino IDE on an Arduino device. All right, I also wanted to mention, you'll notice that when I did the remote debug back there from Visual Studio onto my Galileo, I actually didn't get prompted to authenticate. And so I have to admit, I actually cheated. I tested that out before I went and demoed it on the camera there. And so because I'd already run it once, it had prompted me for my administrator username and password already and didn't prompt me again. But you would see that as you debug the first time, you'll just get prompted for the credentials. And remember, it's your Galileo's administrator username and then whatever password you specified during that apply boot media script. All right, well with that, hopefully you've now got an idea of how you can get Windows onto your Galileo, and then how you can use Visual Studio and the project templates to create code that run on your Galileo under Windows, but still allow you to do the Arduino-y kind of things and talk to your Arduino pins and all that kind of stuff. So with that, let's take a look at some next steps and see where to go from here. So first of all of the SDKs and the content for Galileo, etc., are available up on GitHub. There's that page that I mentioned earlier, the I Bought a Galileo page, where they walk you through the documentation of provisioning your SD card. And that's actually really just one of the many pages in the broader content that's available up on that site. So you can browse all of the content and documentation up there. And then you can actually go into GitHub, into the MSIoT organization, and get access to all of the different samples that are up there. There's the Galileo SDK and a whole bunch of other stuff that's there that you can get to through GitHub. And then at least, just clone it or fork it, but you can also contribute if you'd like. And as I mentioned, in that GitHub, there's a ton of other samples. So there's, the good old Blink sample, which is pretty much what we just did. There's another version of that where you use direct GPIO. Instead of going through the Arduino pin modes and digital read and digital writes, there's direct SDK methods instead. The Quark processor on your Galileo actually has a thermal sensor in there that you can read using analog read. So there's a sample there. There's playing around with 16:2 LCD displays. If you watched the build announcement, there was a piano that was basically being driven, a big human-sized piano off of the Galileo. And so the code and sample documentation is there as well as samples for working with Fermata and Cylon for communication and control, and other samples there as well. And if you feel like you've got a good sample, again, the team is open to contributions. So come up with a great sampler tutorial of your own and contribute it back into that project. Up in the content site, there's also some advanced usage topics. Some of those I've actually already talked about, opening up a network share to your Galileo, as well as configuring remote debugging. But there's other ones up there, like setting up your Galileo to automatically run your sketch on reboot, and some other things there as well that are just good troubleshooting tips, etc. So that's a good page to go to if you want to be able to do maybe something a little more advanced, or if you want to be able to troubleshoot some problems that you're having. Remember that I've got some other videos as well. The link at the bottom of the slide there gets you off to that. And in fact, you can get all of the files, the source code, a zip file that has everything in it, as well as a link off to the videos there as well. So in this session then, again, we started out talking about that Windows developer program for IoT. We saw how to get Windows up on our Galileo, and then how to actually write and run code in Windows on our Galileo boards, and then talked about some next steps. So I hope you're really excited. Please go follow these steps, get Windows running on your Galileo, and have fun.